DL Story 1. The Repeating Mile. Robert Hayes had been driving trucks for 23 years, hauling everything from electronics to livestock across the continental United States. He prided himself on knowing every major highway and most of the back roads between Chicago and the West Coast. In March of 2022, he accepted what seemed like a routine job transporting refrigerated pharmaceuticals from Denver to Salt Lake City along Interstate 80. The route was straightforward, the weather clear, and his rig was running perfectly. Nothing about that evening suggested it would become the night that made him question the fundamental nature of reality itself. He departed Denver just after 8 in the evening, planning to make the delivery by dawn. The highway stretched ahead in the darkness, illuminated only by his headlights and the occasional passing vehicle. Robert had driven this stretch countless times, knew every exit and rest stop. The radio played classic rock, and he sipped coffee from his thermos, settling into the familiar rhythm of the road. Around mile marker 173, he noticed a peculiar rest area he didn't recognize. A simple wooden sign read Waypoint Station in hand-painted letters. Strange, he thought, but he'd been focused on other routes lately. Maybe it was new. He continued driving, watching the mile markers tick past. 174, 175, 176. The highway curved gently through the darkness, mountains rising as shadows on either side. His GPS showed him precisely on course, estimated arrival time unchanged. Everything seemed normal until he saw the sign again. Waypoint Station. The exact same rest area, the same wooden sign appearing at what should have been mile marker 181. Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel. That was impossible. He'd been driving forward continuously, maintaining steady speed. There was no way he'd circled back. He checked his mirrors, seeing only empty highway behind him. The GPS still showed him progressing normally along Interstate 80. He grabbed his CB radio, pressing the transmit button. "This is Nighthauler checking in. Anyone on this channel?" Static answered him. He tried again, switching frequencies. Nothing but white noise across every channel. His phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in this mountainous terrain, but something felt deeply wrong. Robert decided to keep driving, convincing himself he'd simply been mistaken about the rest area. Maybe there were two similar stops, or he'd been more tired than he realized. But his coffee was still hot, his thermos still 3/4 full. He'd only been driving about 45 minutes since leaving Denver. Mile marker 173 appeared ahead. Then 174, 175, 176. And there, impossibly, was the Waypoint Station again. The same wooden sign, the same configuration of parking spaces barely visible in the darkness. Robert's heart hammered against his ribs. He checked the odometer. The numbers were advancing normally. The GPS showed continuous forward progress. But he was seeing the same stretch of highway, the same markers, the same rest area. This time he decided to stop. He pulled into the Waypoint Station, his air brakes hissing in the silence. The rest area was completely deserted. No other vehicles, no lights except a single flickering lamppost near a weathered picnic table. Robert killed the engine and climbed down from the cab, his boots crunching on gravel. The air was cold and unnaturally still. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic sounds. Just oppressive silence. The rest area had a small information kiosk with a map of the area, but when Robert approached it, he found the plexiglass covering fogged and impossible to see through. The picnic table looked decades old, the wood gray and splintered. He walked the perimeter of the parking area, finding nothing unusual except for that pervasive wrongness, that feeling that he'd stepped outside the normal world into somewhere else entirely. He climbed back into his cab and started the engine, deciding to push through whatever this was. The refrigerated cargo was time-sensitive, and he had a schedule to keep. He pulled back onto the highway, accelerating to cruising speed. Mile marker 173, 174, 175, 176, waypoint station. Robert drove past without stopping this time, his jaw clenched. He tried the CB again, still nothing. He watched his GPS carefully, seeing it show forward progress even as he passed the same landmarks again. The loop was perhaps 8 miles long, he calculated. Same curve in the road, same rock formation visible against the stars. Same exit sign for a town called Hartwell that he'd never heard of. He'd been trapped in this loop for over an hour now, he realized, checking his watch. Or had he? Time felt slippery, uncertain. His phone still showed 8:47, the same time he'd last checked it 30 minutes ago. He tapped the screen, but it was frozen, unresponsive. The clock on his dashboard showed 9:23. His watch showed 8:39. 3 different times, all equally impossible. The 4th time through the loop, Robert noticed something new. A figure standing beside the waypoint station sign. Tall, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned trucker's jacket. The figure didn't move as Robert approached, didn't react to the headlights. Robert slowed down, squinting through the windshield. The figure's face was obscured by shadow, but something about its proportions seemed wrong. Too tall, limbs too long, stance too rigid. Robert accelerated past, his skin crawling. In his rearview mirror, he saw the figure turn to watch him go, movement fluid and wrong, like a film played at the incorrect speed. He pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the rig faster than he should on this unfamiliar loop. Mile markers flew past. 173, 174, 175, 176. The figure was still there, but now it stood in the middle of the highway. Robert swerved, his trailer fishtailing slightly. He fought for control, managing to avoid the figure by mere feet. In that brief moment as he passed, he glimpsed what he thought was a face, but the features were blurred, indistinct, like a photograph taken through running water. The CB radio suddenly burst to life with his own voice, saying words he'd spoken an hour ago. "This is Nighthauler checking in. Anyone on this channel?" Panic rising in his chest, Robert drove on. The loop continued. 5 times, 6 times, 7. Each time the figure appeared in a different location, standing on the shoulder, sitting at the picnic table, walking along the center line, always watching, always wrong. Robert stopped looking in his mirrors, stopped checking his instruments. He just drove, hands locked on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead. On the 9th or 10th loop, he couldn't remember which, he noticed something else. His cargo bay was making sounds. Not the normal hum of the refrigeration unit, but scratching, scraping sounds as if something inside was trying to get out. He knew his cargo. Sealed pharmaceutical containers, nothing that could make noise. But the scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent. Then on what might have been the 15th loop, something changed. As he approached mile marker 176 as the waypoint station came into view, the figure stood directly in front of his truck, arms raised. Robert had no time to stop, no room to swerve. He braced for impact, squeezing his eyes shut. The truck shuddered violently and everything went white. When Robert opened his eyes, he was past the waypoint station. Mile marker 177 appeared ahead, then 178. 179. The loop was broken. He was moving forward again, truly forward, leaving that impossible stretch of highway behind. His phone came to life, notifications chiming, signal restored. The CB crackled with normal traffic chatter. His dashboard clock read 11:37. Nearly 3 hours had passed. Robert pulled over at the next rest area, a normal, well-lit facility with other trucks and cars. He sat in his cab, hands shaking, and tried to process what had happened. He checked his cargo. Everything was sealed and intact, temperature holding steady, no sign of disturbance. He examined his truck for damage from the collision that never quite happened. Nothing. Not a scratch. He completed his delivery on schedule, though he remembered nothing of the remaining drive. The pharmaceutical company signed for the cargo, noting no issues. Robert said nothing about what had happened. Who would believe him? He barely believed it himself. But when he checked his route history on the GPS, he found something that made his blood run cold. For those 3 hours, the GPS had recorded no movement at all. Just a stationary point on Interstate 80 at mile marker 174.5. Robert Hayes still drives trucks, but he refuses any routes along that stretch of Interstate 80. When other drivers mention unusual experiences on that highway, strange loops, or lost time, he listens but never shares his own story. He keeps a detailed log now, noting every mile marker, every stop, comparing times across multiple devices. And sometimes, late at night, he thinks he hears scratching sounds from empty cargo bays, sees figures standing too still beside distant roads, feels the world slip sideways into impossible geometries. He knows now that the highways of America hold pockets of something else, places where the rules break down, where trucks can drive forever without going anywhere at all. He knows that Waypoint Station is still there, waiting on a stretch of road that exists and doesn't exist, trapping the unwary in its endless loop. And he knows that whatever he drove through that night, whatever stood in his path with its arms raised, let him go for reasons he'll never understand. The thought that it might not be so merciful next time keeps him awake as the miles roll past and the highway stretches endlessly ahead into darkness. Story 2. The Girl in the Rest Stop. Patricia Sullivan had 31 years of experience behind the wheel when she encountered something that made her question whether her decades on the road had prepared her for anything at all. She specialized in late-night long-haul routes, preferring the empty highways and the solitude of darkness. In October of 2023, she was hauling furniture from Atlanta to Portland, Maine, a route that took her through the Appalachian region along Interstate 81 during the darkest hours before dawn. Around 3 in the morning, Patricia pulled into a rest area in rural Virginia. The facility was old but maintained, with harsh fluorescent lights illuminating a parking area, restroom building, and a few vending machines. 2 other trucks were parked at the far end, their cabs dark. Patricia needed coffee and a bathroom break before the final push through the night. She grabbed her wallet and climbed down from her rig, her joints protesting slightly. 56 years old now, the job was getting harder on her body, but she loved the freedom of the road too much to quit. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and damp earth. Her footsteps echoed as she walked toward the restroom building. That's when she noticed the girl. Maybe 12 years old, wearing a white dress that seemed too thin for the cold October night. She stood near the vending machines, perfectly still, staring at Patricia with dark eyes. No parents visible, no vehicle that might have brought her here, just a child alone at a rest stop in the middle of nowhere at 3 in the morning. Patricia's maternal instincts kicked in immediately. "Hey, sweetheart," she called out, approaching carefully. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The girl didn't respond, didn't blink, just kept staring with those unsettling dark eyes. Patricia got closer, noticing details that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The white dress was old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s. The girl's skin was pale, almost luminescent in the harsh lights, and she wasn't breathing. Patricia watched the girl's chest, waiting to see it rise and fall, but there was no movement at all. "Can you hear me?" Patricia asked, now only about 10 feet away. The girl's mouth opened and she spoke in a voice that sounded wrong, like multiple voices overlapping, slightly out of sync. "Can you take me home?" The words echoed strangely, seeming to come from all directions at once rather than from the girl's mouth. Patricia felt ice water flood her veins. Every instinct screamed danger. She backed away slowly, not taking her eyes off the girl. "Where's home, honey?" Patricia asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The girl tilted her head at an angle that was too severe, too sharp, like a bird examining prey. "I don't remember," the overlapping voices said. "I've been waiting so long. Can you take me home?" The girl took a step forward, and Patricia noticed she didn't quite touch the ground. Her feet hovered perhaps an inch above the pavement, the white dress swaying as if in a breeze that didn't exist. Patricia turned and walked quickly back toward her truck, not running but moving with purpose. She heard footsteps behind her, though she'd seen the girl floating. Quick, pattering footsteps like a child running. She didn't look back, didn't want to see what was following her. She reached her truck and climbed into the cab, locking the doors with shaking hands. Through the windshield, she saw the girl standing where Patricia had been moments ago, still staring, still impossibly motionless. Her CB radio crackled to life without Patricia touching it. The overlapping voices came through the speaker. "Please take me home. I've been waiting. Please, please, please." The word repeated, growing more insistent, more desperate, until it became a wall of sound filling the cab. Patricia switched off the radio, but the voices continued, now coming from her phone, her dashboard speakers seeming to emanate from the very air around her. She started the engine, her hands trembling so badly she could barely turn the key. The voices stopped abruptly, leaving ringing silence. Through the windshield, the girl was gone. The rest area looked empty, normal, just fluorescent lights and pavement and the two dark trucks at the far end. Patricia didn't hesitate. She put the truck in gear and pulled out of the rest area, tires squealing slightly as she accelerated back onto the interstate. Her heart pounded as she drove, checking her mirrors constantly, expecting to see the girl somehow following, sitting in her trailer, appearing in the cab beside her. Nothing. Just empty highway behind her, darkness pressing against her headlights ahead. She tried to rationalize what she'd seen. Exhaustion, perhaps. Hallucination brought on by too many hours driving. But she'd been well rested when she started this shift, had slept properly before departing Atlanta, and the voices had been real, had come from her equipment, had surrounded her with undeniable physicality. 20 miles down the interstate, Patricia noticed something in her passenger mirror, a white shape in the sleeper berth behind her seat. She jerked her head around, nearly swerving off the road. The girl sat on the bed, hands folded in her lap, staring at Patricia with those bottomless dark eyes. "You didn't take me home," the voices said, sad and accusing. Patricia screamed, actually screamed, something she hadn't done since childhood. She swerved to the shoulder, brakes squealing, bringing the truck to a rough stop. She grabbed the door handle, ready to flee into the night, but the girl spoke again. "You can't leave. You can't run. I just want to go home." Patricia turned back to look. The girl remained motionless on the bed, that too white skin, that impossible stillness. "Where is home?" Patricia demanded, her voice hoarse. "Tell me where, and I'll take you there, I swear." The girl's head tilted again, that severe angle that hurt to look at. "I don't remember. It's been so long, decades and decades and decades. They all leave me. They all drive away. No one takes me home." The overlapping voices held such profound sadness that Patricia felt tears spring to her eyes despite her terror. "How long have you been at that rest stop?" she asked. The girl's expression didn't change. "Since the night we crashed, since the fire, since I woke up alone." Patricia's mind raced. She pulled out her phone, hands still shaking, and searched for accidents at that rest stop. It took several tries, her fingers fumbling on the screen, but she found it. 1963. A family of 4 traveling from Pennsylvania to Florida had crashed on the interstate near that rest stop. Vehicle fire, parents and teenage son killed instantly. Younger daughter, age 11, never found. Name, Emily Cartwright. The accident report speculated she'd wandered away from the crash in shock, died of exposure in the woods. Body never recovered. Emily? Patricia said softly. The girl's eyes widened slightly, the first change in expression Patricia had seen. Is that my name? The voices whispered. I couldn't remember. I've been trying to remember. Patricia felt her terror shift into something else. Not quite pity, not quite compassion, but a recognition of suffering so deep and prolonged, it transcended normal human experience. Emily, I think I know what happened to you, Patricia said carefully. I think you died a long time ago. I think you've been waiting at that rest stop trying to find your way home, but home doesn't exist anymore. Your family is gone. I'm so sorry. The girl, Emily, sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then she spoke again, and this time the voices were clearer, more unified. I know I'm dead. I've always known, but I can't leave. I'm tied to that place. I'm stuck. Patricia didn't know what to say. She wasn't equipped for this, wasn't trained in dealing with ghosts or spirits or whatever Emily was. But she'd been a mother once, before her daughter had grown up and moved away, and those instincts ran deep. What can I do? She asked. How can I help you? Emily's head straightened slightly. Take me home, to where home used to be. Maybe I can leave if I see it one more time. Maybe I can rest. Patricia checked the accident report again. The Cartwright family had lived in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. That was several hours back north, completely off her route, would put her seriously behind schedule. But looking at Emily's too still form, at those dark eyes that held decades of loneliness and confusion, Patricia made a decision. Okay, she said. Okay, Emily, I'll take you home. She turned the truck around at the next exit, heading back north on Interstate 81. Emily remained in the sleeper berth, silent now, watching the darkness pass beyond the windows. Patricia drove through the night, the highway mostly empty, occasionally passing other trucks whose drivers had no idea what cargo Patricia carried. She called her dispatcher, leaving a message that she'd had mechanical trouble and would be delayed. The lie came easily, necessary. Dawn was breaking when Patricia reached Harrisburg. She used the address from the accident report, finding a neighborhood of modest homes. The specific address led to a house that looked nothing like it would have in 1963. Renovated, expanded, modernized. A young couple's car sat in the driveway. This wasn't Emily's home anymore, not really, but perhaps it would be enough. Patricia parked on the street and turned to face Emily. We're here, she said softly. Emily stared at the house, her expression unreadable. I remember, she whispered, the voices finally singular, just one child's voice. I remember my room. I remember the tree in the backyard. I remember my mother's voice. She turned to Patricia, and for the first time she smiled. It was a heartbreaking expression, full of relief and sorrow. Thank you, Emily said. Thank you for bringing me home. She faded then, not dramatically, not with any sound or light, just gradually becoming more transparent until Patricia was staring at empty air. The oppressive presence that had filled the cab was gone. Patricia sat alone in her truck, tears running down her face, watching the sun rise over Harrisburg. She didn't understand what had just happened. Didn't have any framework for processing it, but she knew with absolute certainty that Emily Cartwright had finally found peace after 60 years of waiting. Patricia eventually continued to Portland, arriving 2 days late with an excuse about transmission trouble that her company accepted grudgingly. She never told anyone the true story, knowing how insane it would sound. But she researched Emily obsessively for weeks afterward, finding old newspaper articles, school photos, records of the search that had failed to find her body. She learned that Emily had been an honor student, loved animals, wanted to be a veterinarian. A whole life that never got lived, reduced to a ghost haunting a rest stop. Patricia Sullivan still drives trucks, still takes those late-night routes through empty highways. But she's different now, more aware of the weight of tragedy that soaks into certain places, the residue of suffering that lingers long after death. She stops at that rest area sometimes, the one in rural Virginia where she first saw Emily. It feels normal now, empty of presence, just another place for weary travelers to pause. She hopes that means Emily truly found rest, that taking her home was enough to break whatever bound her to that spot. Sometimes, late at night, Patricia thinks she hears a child's voice on the CB radio, just a whisper saying, "Thank you," before fading into static. She tells herself it's imagination, interference, tiredness playing tricks. But part of her knows better. Part of her understands that the highways of America are haunted by more than just the living, that every mile of pavement holds stories of those who never completed their journeys, who wait in the darkness for someone to finally take them home. Story 3. The Convoy of Shadows. Marcus Thompson had been hauling freight for 18 years when he encountered the convoy that shouldn't exist. He was driving a load of agricultural equipment from Omaha to Phoenix in January of 2024, taking Interstate 40 through New Mexico during a night when fog rolled across the desert like something alive. Visibility was poor, his headlights creating a tunnel of diffused light that revealed the road only 20 feet ahead. He'd slowed to 40 miles per hour, hazard lights blinking, tension knotting his shoulders as he navigated the treacherous conditions. Around midnight, he noticed lights behind him. Not the normal white headlights and red taillights of modern vehicles, but amber lights, the kind used on trucks decades ago. A convoy was approaching, at least 5 or 6 trucks from what Marcus could see in his mirrors. They drove in tight formation, too close together for safety, maintaining perfect spacing despite the fog. Marcus frowned. That kind of precision driving in these conditions was nearly impossible, even for experienced truckers. The convoy pulled up behind him, matching his speed exactly. Marcus tried his CB radio. "This is Desert Runner to the convoy behind me. You folks should spread out more in this fog. That formation's dangerous." Static answered him. He tried again on Channel 19, the standard trucker channel. Nothing. The convoy remained behind him, those amber lights glowing through the fog like the eyes of predators. Marcus decided to let them pass. He slowed down further, pulling slightly toward the shoulder to give them room. But the convoy slowed as well, maintaining that exact distance behind him. They didn't attempt to pass. They just followed, silent and precise, those amber lights unwavering. An uneasy feeling crept up Marcus's spine. Something was very wrong about this. He accelerated, bringing his speed back up to 50 miles per hour despite the dangerous visibility. The convoy accelerated in perfect synchronization. He slowed to 35. They slowed. He changed lanes. They changed lanes. They were matching his every movement with impossible coordination, as if they were all controlled by a single mind. Marcus's uneasiness deepened into genuine fear. The fog seemed to thicken around him, becoming so dense that even his headlights barely penetrated. He could see only a few feet ahead now, just the broken white line marking the lane edge and a hint of pavement. The convoy's amber lights remained perfectly visible behind him, cutting through the fog as if it didn't exist. That shouldn't be possible. Light didn't work that way. But there they were, steady and unblinking following. Marcus checked his GPS. According to the device, he was still on Interstate 40, but something felt off. The road seemed narrower than he remembered, the surface rougher. No mile markers were visible through the fog, no signs indicating exits or services. Just endless pavement stretching ahead into white nothingness, with the convoy behind him and nothing else. No other vehicles, no lights from distant towns, just him and them. His CB suddenly crackled to life. A voice came through, distorted and strange, like an old recording played on damaged equipment. Maintain speed. Maintain formation. Deliver the cargo. Marcus grabbed the microphone. Who is this? What cargo? The voice repeated exactly the same words. Maintain speed. Maintain formation. Deliver the cargo. Other voices joined in, all saying the same thing, overlapping until it became a chorus of mechanical repetition. Marcus switched off the CB, his heart pounding. He looked in his mirrors again, trying to get a better view of the trucks behind him. Through the fog, he could see shapes, but they were wrong somehow. The trucks looked old-fashioned, like models from the 1970s or 80s, but their outlines were blurred, indistinct, as if they were only partially solid. And he still couldn't see any drivers in the cabs, just empty windows reflecting his taillights. He tried his phone, no signal. That wasn't unusual in this remote stretch of New Mexico, but combined with everything else, it felt ominous. The GPS still showed him on Interstate 40, but the display was glitching, jumping erratically, sometimes showing him miles ahead of where he'd been seconds ago, sometimes showing him in impossible locations off the mapped highway entirely. The fog began to lift slightly, and Marcus saw something that made his blood run cold. The road ahead split into two paths. One continued as a normal interstate highway, vanishing into the thinning fog. The other path, the one he was currently on, had changed. The pavement looked ancient, cracked and weathered, with faded yellow paint barely visible. And this path curved away from the interstate, heading into darkness. Marcus jerked the wheel, trying to steer onto the proper highway. His truck didn't respond correctly. It felt like he was driving through mud or water, resistance fighting against his steering. The truck continued on the old road despite his efforts, pulled by some force he couldn't overcome. Behind him, the convoy followed, maintaining that precise formation, those amber lights glowing steadily. He pressed the accelerator to the floor, the engine roaring. The speedometer climbed, but the sensation of speed didn't match. He felt like he was moving in slow motion, the world around him viscous and resistant. The old road continued into darkness, the fog closing in again, and Marcus realized with horror that he'd left the real Interstate 40 behind. He was somewhere else now, somewhere that existed adjacent to the normal world but operated by different rules. Structures appeared through the fog, old abandoned buildings that Marcus didn't recognize. A gas station with analog pumps, the price sign showing impossibly low numbers. A diner with a flickering neon sign advertising coffee for 15 cents. A motel with a vacancy sign in a style from decades past. All of them empty, dark, frozen in time. The old road ran through this ghost town of forgotten places, and the convoy pushed Marcus forward, not allowing him to stop or turn back. The CB crackled again. More voices now, dozens of them, all repeating the same thing. Maintain speed, maintain formation, deliver the cargo. Marcus's hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. What cargo? He screamed at the radio. I'm hauling agricultural equipment. What do you want from me? One voice separated from the chorus, clearer than the others, speaking different words. You're hauling what we need. You're bringing what was taken. The road demands its due. Marcus didn't understand. His cargo was legitimate, documented, secured properly. Just farming equipment, nothing mysterious or valuable beyond its monetary worth. What could these phantom trucks possibly want with it? The old road continued for what felt like hours, though his dashboard clock showed only minutes passing. More abandoned structures appeared and disappeared in the fog. Marcus saw other vehicles too, rusted husks of cars and trucks from various decades, sitting beside the road as if they'd simply stopped and never started again. Some still had skeletons visible in the driver's seats, though Marcus told himself he was Hallucinating, that exhaustion and fear were making him see things that couldn't be real. Then ahead in the fog, he saw a massive structure. It looked like a warehouse, ancient and decrepit, with walls made of corrugated metal so rusted they were more hole than solid surface. The old road led directly to an open bay door, a black rectangle that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The convoy behind Marcus maintained their formation, pressing him forward toward that darkness. Marcus made a decision. He slammed on the brakes, pulling the emergency brake, doing everything he could to stop his truck. The rig shuddered and groaned but continued forward, sliding across the pavement as if on ice, pulled inexorably toward the warehouse. The convoy closed in, those amber lights brightening, and Marcus heard the engines now, a deep rumbling that wasn't quite mechanical, that sounded almost organic. His truck entered the warehouse, darkness swallowing him completely. He couldn't see anything, couldn't even see his own dashboard lights. But he felt movement around him, heard sounds like massive gears turning, metal scraping metal, chains rattling. His trailer lurched and he felt it disconnect from the cab. The cargo was being taken. Marcus sat frozen in his cab, surrounded by absolute darkness, listening to his trailer being moved away. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time felt meaningless in this place, then suddenly light. Not the diffused fog light from before, but normal daylight. Marcus blinked, disoriented, and found himself sitting in his truck at a rest area. Not the warehouse, not the old road, but a regular interstate rest stop with other trucks and cars parked nearby. He climbed out on shaking legs, looking around wildly. The sun was rising, painting the sky orange and pink. His trailer was still attached to his cab. He walked back and checked it, finding the doors still sealed, the cargo apparently intact. His phone showed a signal, dozens of missed calls and messages from his dispatcher wondering why he hadn't checked in. According to the timestamp, 8 hours had passed since he'd driven into that fog. Marcus checked his GPS history. It showed him traveling normally along Interstate 40 through the night. No detours, no old roads, just steady progress from Omaha toward Phoenix. But he remembered every moment of that nightmare drive. Remembered the convoy and the abandoned buildings in the warehouse darkness. He opened his trailer, breaking the seal, and climbed inside to inspect the cargo. Everything was there, or seemed to be. The farming equipment sat in its proper places, strapped down and secure. But something was different. The metal looked older somehow, more weathered, as if years had passed rather than hours. And when Marcus checked his manifest against the actual cargo, he found discrepancies. Small things. A serial number that didn't match. A manufacturing date that showed 1987 on equipment. That should have been brand new. Pieces that looked identical to what he'd loaded in Omaha but weren't quite right. He completed the delivery to Phoenix, saying nothing about what had happened. The client accepted the cargo without comment, signing off on the delivery. Marcus received his payment and headed home, trying to convince himself it had all been a hallucination, that the fog and exhaustion had caused him to imagine the impossible. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something real had happened, that he'd driven on roads that existed outside normal geography, that the convoy had taken his actual cargo and replaced it with older versions of the same items, pulling them from some past era and substituting them for the present-day equipment. Marcus Thompson still drives trucks, but he refuses any routes through New Mexico. He's heard stories from other drivers, whispered tales shared late at night at truck stops. Stories about convoys that appear in fog and darkness, about old roads that lead to places outside time, about cargo that gets replaced with items from decades past. Some drivers claim the convoy is made up of truckers who died while making deliveries, doomed to continue their routes forever, needing replacement cargo to maintain their eternal schedules. Marcus doesn't know if that's true. He doesn't know what happened to the equipment he loaded in Omaha, where it ended up, whether it's still traveling on those impossible roads or sitting in that dark warehouse. But he knows he was taken somewhere else that night, pulled into a dimension or time or place that operates parallel to the normal world. He knows the amber lights were real, the voices were real, the sensation of being pulled along by forces beyond his control was real. And sometimes, driving at night through fog, Marcus sees amber lights in his mirrors. They're always distant, never close enough to identify clearly, but they're there, following, waiting. He wonders if the convoy ever lets you go completely, or if once you've driven on their roads, you're marked forever, tagged as someone who can cross between worlds. He wonders if one day those amber lights will pull up close behind him again, and this time there won't be any escape, any return to normal highways and daylight rest stops. The thought haunts him as he drives through the night, always checking his mirrors, always watching for lights that glow with the wrong color, always listening for voices on the CB repeating that mechanical phrase. Maintain speed, maintain formation, deliver the cargo. Words that have become a nightmare mantra, a reminder that the American highway system has layers and depths that most people never encounter. Roads that run through shadows and time itself, patrolled by convoys that serve purposes the living can't understand. Story 4. The facility off exit 93. Jennifer Morrison had 15 years of trucking experience when she took a wrong turn that led to a place that shouldn't exist. She was hauling electronics from Seattle to Boise in April of 2023, running behind schedule due to weather delays. Around 2 in the morning, exhausted and struggling to stay alert, she took an exit off Interstate 90 looking for a place to rest. Exit 93, according to the sign, though Jennifer didn't remember seeing this particular exit on her route planning. The exit ramp led to a 2-lane road that curved through dark pine forest. No buildings were visible, no gas stations or convenience stores, just trees pressing close on both sides. Jennifer drove slowly, looking for a pull-off area where she could safely park for a few hours. The road continued for several miles, winding deeper into the forest, and Jennifer began to realize she'd made a mistake. This didn't look like it led anywhere useful. She decided to turn around, but the road was too narrow. She needed to find a wider section or an intersection where she could maneuver the rig safely. The road continued climbing, the grade increasing, engine working harder. Then ahead she saw lights. Bright white lights, like high-intensity floodlights, illuminating an area through the trees. Relief flooded through her. Some kind of facility where she could ask for directions, maybe even park for a while. The road opened into a large clearing. In the center stood a massive complex of buildings, all identical structures made of bare concrete, arranged in precise geometric patterns around a central courtyard. The floodlights were mounted on tall poles, creating an area of harsh illumination surrounded by absolute darkness. No signs identified the facility, no vehicles were visible. The architecture was brutalist and cold, all right angles and bare surfaces, looking like something from a dystopian film. Jennifer pulled into what appeared to be a parking area near the entrance, though no lines marked spaces. She sat in her cab, studying the complex. Something felt deeply wrong about this place. It was too isolated, too stark, too empty. What kind of facility operated in the middle of nowhere with no identification, no security presence, no vehicles? But she was here now, and she needed information about how to get back to the interstate. She climbed down from her cab, stretching tired muscles. The air was cold and smelled faintly chemical, like industrial cleaning products mixed with something else she couldn't identify. Her footsteps echoed strangely as she walked toward the nearest building, sound reflecting off the concrete in odd ways. The floodlights created sharp shadows, making the geometry of the space disorienting and difficult to judge. The building had a single door, metal and unmarked. Jennifer tried the handle, expecting it to be locked. It opened smoothly, revealing a long hallway lit by fluorescent lights. The walls were the same bare concrete as the exterior, the floor polished and clean. Doors lined both sides of the hallway, all closed, all identical. No signs, no numbers, no indication of what any of the rooms contained. "Hello," Jennifer called out. Her voice echoed down the hallway, seeming to go on longer than it should, repeating and distorting. No one answered. She walked down the hallway, her footsteps abnormally loud in the silence. She tried one of the doors. Locked. Another. Locked. All of them locked except one near the end of the hallway. This door opened into a room that looked like an office, though a strange one. A desk sat in the center with a computer terminal that looked decades old, the kind with a green phosphor monitor and a keyboard yellowed with age. Papers covered the desk, all of them printed with numbers, rows, and columns of data that meant nothing to Jennifer. Filing cabinets lined the walls, drawers slightly open, more papers visible inside. Jennifer approached the desk, looking for anything that might explain this place. A nameplate sat on the corner of the desk, but the text was blurred, unreadable, as if the words had been deliberately obscured. The papers were the same, covered in numbers and letters that seemed to shift when Jennifer looked directly at them, refusing to resolve into anything meaningful. A sound made her jump, footsteps coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Not casual footsteps, but marching, precise and synchronized, like multiple people walking in perfect lockstep. Jennifer's heart rate spiked. She backed toward the door, listening. The footsteps grew louder, closer, coming down a hallway she couldn't see. She stepped into the main corridor, looking for the source of the sound. At the far end of the hallway, figures appeared. Jennifer's breath caught. They looked like people wearing identical gray uniforms, walking in formation. 6 of them moving as one unit, their steps synchronized to the point of inhumanity. Their faces were wrong, too smooth, too identical, like masks or mannequins rather than living flesh. They turned their heads in unison, fixing on Jennifer, and changed direction, walking straight toward her. Jennifer ran. She sprinted back the way she'd come, her breath coming in panicked gasps. Behind her, the footsteps followed, maintaining that mechanical precision, not speeding up or slowing down, just continuing at their steady march. She burst through the exterior door and into the courtyard, the harsh floodlights momentarily blinding her. She ran toward her truck, fumbling for her keys. The figures emerged from the building behind her. They didn't run, didn't hurry, just walked in formation across the courtyard. But they were closing the distance impossibly fast, covering ground with each step that no normal human stride could match. Jennifer reached her truck and threw herself into the cab, slamming the door and locking it. She jammed the key into the ignition, turning it desperately. The engine turned over, started, and she threw the truck into gear. As she accelerated out the parking area, she looked in her mirrors. The figures had stopped at the edge of the parking area, standing in their precise formation, watching her leave. But there were more of them now. Dozens, all wearing the same gray uniforms, all with those 2 smooth faces. They stood perfectly still, a formation of identical watchers, and Jennifer felt their gazes following her as she drove away. The road out of the facility was different. Jennifer was certain she'd approached from the north, but the only exit she could find led south, back down the mountain on a road that didn't match the one she'd driven up. She didn't care. She just drove, pushing the truck as fast as she dared on the winding road, desperate to get away from that nightmare complex. After 20 minutes of driving, she reached an intersection. Interstate 90 appeared ahead, the normal highway she knew, with normal traffic and normal signs. Jennifer merged onto the interstate, her hands shaking so badly she could barely control the wheel. She drove for another hour before pulling into a truck stop. a normal commercial facility with a restaurant and fuel pumps and other trucks parked in neat rows. She sat in her cab for a long time trying to process what had happened. She pulled up maps on her phone looking for the facility. Nothing showed on any map at exit 93. In fact, according to the map, there was no exit 93 on this stretch of Interstate 90. The exits jumped from 92 to 94. The exit she'd taken didn't exist. Jennifer went inside the truck stop and asked the clerk about facilities in the area. The clerk looked at her strangely and said there was nothing but forest in the surrounding mountains. No industrial complexes or government installations for at least 50 miles. Jennifer described what she'd seen, and the clerk's expression shifted from confusion to concern. He suggested she get some rest, maybe see a doctor if she was having vision problems. She completed her delivery to Boise the next day, saying nothing more about the facility. But she researched obsessively for weeks, trying to find any information about what she'd encountered. She found fragments, hints, buried in obscure forums and conspiracy websites. Other truckers had reported similar experiences in various parts of the country. Facilities that appeared off exits that didn't exist, identical buildings with synchronized occupants, places that vanished when you tried to find them again. Some theories suggested government black sites, secret installations conducting classified research. Others proposed something more existential, places that existed in parallel to normal reality, pockets of otherness that occasionally intersected with our world. Jennifer didn't know which explanation she preferred. Both were terrifying in different ways. Jennifer Morrison still drives trucks, but she's obsessive now about checking her route before every trip, memorizing exits, confirming maps against multiple sources. She never drives when she's too tired, never takes unfamiliar exits, never investigates unexplained lights in isolated areas. And she watches for those synchronized walkers, those too smooth faces, those gray uniforms that signal something far beyond normal human experience. She knows now that the American landscape contains places that exist outside normal geography, installations that serve purposes the public doesn't know about or aren't meant to be understood. She knows that taking the wrong exit can lead you somewhere you were never meant to go, where the rules of reality don't quite apply, where things that look like people watch and wait with incomprehensible patience. Sometimes, late at night, Jennifer sees exit signs for exits that don't match her maps. Exit 93 appears sometimes even on highways that shouldn't have an exit with that number. She always drives past, never slowing, never looking back. But she wonders who or what maintains those facilities, what happens in those identical concrete buildings, why those synchronized figures march through empty hallways in perfect formation. The questions haunt her, but she knows better than to seek answers. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some doors are meant to stay closed, some exits are meant to be ignored. The facility off exit 93 waits in the mountains or in hundreds of mountains across the country, accessible through exits that appear and disappear, always identical, always empty, always watching for the next lost traveler who takes a wrong turn and discovers that the world has depths and layers far stranger than maps can show. Story 5. The Cargo That Breathed. Daniel Reeves had been in the trucking business for 27 years, specializing in refrigerated cargo. He'd hauled everything from frozen foods to medical supplies, always maintaining proper temperature controls, always delivering on time. In July of 2024, he accepted a job that seemed routine but would become the most disturbing experience of his long career. The manifest described the cargo as biological samples for a research facility, temperature maintained at exactly 37 degrees Fahrenheit, delivery required within 72 hours. Daniel picked up the cargo from a warehouse in Minneapolis at midnight. The facility was unremarkable, a standard distribution center with loading docks and forklifts and workers in safety vests. They loaded his trailer with 10 large containers, each about the size of a coffin, sealed with heavy locks and warning labels about maintaining temperature. The paperwork was in order, the locks were documented, and Daniel signed off on the cargo without any concerns. Just another job hauling sensitive materials across the country to a destination in New Orleans. He started driving south, making good time on Interstate 35. The night was clear and warm, traffic light, conditions perfect for covering miles. Around 3 in the morning, somewhere in Iowa, Daniel heard something that made him frown. A sound from his trailer transmitted through the cab's communication system that let him monitor temperature and cargo conditions. A rhythmic thumping, like something heavy shifting despite the tie-downs. Daniel pulled over at the next rest area and walked back to inspect his trailer. Everything looked secure from the outside. Temperature gauge showed 37 degrees exactly as required. The locking mechanism on the doors was intact, seals unbroken. But he could hear the sound more clearly now that he was standing beside the trailer. Thump. 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 A steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat amplified to massive size. He pressed his ear against the trailer's side panel. The sound was definitely coming from inside, and it wasn't just cargo shifting. It had an organic quality, a wetness to it, like something moving through viscous fluid. Daniel's uneasiness grew. He pulled out his phone and called the dispatcher who'd arranged this job. No answer. He tried the warehouse where he'd picked up the cargo. No answer. He checked the client information on the manifest, finding only a generic company name and a New Orleans address with no contact number. Daniel stood beside his trailer in the quiet rest area, listening to that rhythmic thumping, and made a decision. He'd been doing this job long enough to know when something wasn't right. Biological samples didn't make sounds. They didn't move. They certainly didn't create rhythmic thumping like a massive heartbeat. He needed to know what he was actually carrying. The seals would show if he opened the trailer, which would violate his contract and possibly cost him the job. But Daniel's instinct for self-preservation was stronger than his professional obligation. He cut the seals and unlocked the doors, swinging them open. Cold air rolled out, carrying a smell that made him gag. Not the clean antiseptic smell of medical samples, but something organic and rotten, like meat left too long in a broken freezer. The 10 containers sat in neat rows, secured with straps. They were indeed coffin-sized, made of white plastic with sealed lids. Warning labels covered every surface, biohazard symbols mixed with text in several languages warning about contamination and quarantine protocols. But the labels looked wrong, printed on cheap paper that was already peeling. Text that included spelling errors and grammatical mistakes no legitimate medical company would make. The thumping was louder with the doors open, clearly emanating from one of the containers in the middle. Daniel approached it carefully, his heart racing. The container's surface was cold to the touch, condensation beating on the plastic. The thumping continued, steady and powerful, vibrating through the container into Daniel's hand. He found the latches holding the lid closed and hesitated. Opening this would be a point of no return, would confirm that he was carrying something very wrong, something dangerous. He opened it. The lid lifted with a hiss of escaping air, and Daniel staggered back, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. The container was filled with amber fluid, thick and viscous. Floating in the fluid was something that might have once been human but had been changed, transformed into something else. The body was bloated and pale, skin translucent, revealing systems of tubes and sacs beneath the surface that pulsed with that rhythmic thumping. The face was recognizable as human in structure, but wrong in every detail. Eyes too large and entirely black. Mouth stretched too wide, filled with teeth that looked like they belonged to a deep-sea fish. The thing's eyes opened, focusing on Daniel. It moved in the fluid, limbs that were too long with too many joints flexing and pressing against the container's sides. The mouth opened, and even though it was submerged in fluid, Daniel heard it scream. A high-pitched, ululating sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his skull, causing instant and profound pain. Daniel slammed the lid closed and staggered out of the trailer, his head throbbing, vision blurred. He bent over, hands on his knees, gasping, fighting the urge to vomit. What the hell was that? Not biological samples, not anything that should exist. Something that had been human once, maybe, but transformed into something nightmarish, kept alive in that amber fluid, aware and suffering. He needed to call someone, needed to report this, but who? The police? And tell them what? That he'd broken the seals on his cargo and found genetically modified humans or aliens or something he couldn't even describe? He'd sound insane. They'd think he was hallucinating or lying. And what would happen to him when whoever had shipped this cargo found out he'd discovered what he was carrying? Daniel's phone rang, making him jump. Unknown number. He answered it, his hand shaking. A voice spoke, calm and professional, but with an undertone that made Daniel's skin crawl. Mr. Reeves, we've detected a temperature fluctuation in your cargo bay. Is everything all right? Daniel's blood turned to ice. They were monitoring the trailer remotely, had sensors that tracked when he opened it. They knew. Everything's fine, Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. Just performing a routine inspection, temperatures holding at 37 degrees. Silence on the other end, lasting several seconds. Then the voice spoke again, still calm, still professional. We appreciate your diligence, Mr. Reeves. Please close the cargo bay and continue to your destination. Time is critical for these samples. Any delay could result in degradation, which would be very unfortunate for everyone involved. The emphasis on those last words carried clear threat. Daniel understood. He was expected to deliver this cargo without further questions, without investigating further, without involving anyone else. The alternative was implied but obvious. Understood, Daniel said. I'll proceed directly to New Orleans. He ended the call and stood in the rest area, trapped between horror at what he was carrying and fear of what would happen if he refused to complete the delivery. He closed the trailer doors, the thumping still audible, and climbed back into his cab. His hands shook as he started the engine and pulled back onto the interstate. He drove south through the remainder of the night and into the morning, his mind racing. What were those things in the containers? Where had they come from? What was going to be done with them in New Orleans? Nothing about this made sense. Nothing fit with any legitimate research or medical purpose he could imagine. He considered calling the FBI, Homeland Security, someone who dealt with biological threats. But the people shipping this cargo had his information, knew his route, could monitor his trailer remotely. They clearly had resources and connections. If he involved authorities, would they even get there in time to help? Or would he simply disappear? Another trucker who vanished on a lonely highway. The thumping continued throughout the day, that rhythmic pulse like a giant heart beating in his trailer. Daniel could feel it through his seat, could hear it during the rare moments when traffic noise faded. Other sounds joined it as he crossed into Arkansas. Scratching sounds like nails dragging across metal. Wet sliding sounds like something moving through liquid, and occasionally that screaming, transmitted through the trailer's structure directly into his consciousness, causing spikes of pain that made him swerve dangerously. He stopped only for fuel, rushing through each stop, refusing to spend more than a few minutes outside his cab. Other truckers looked at his trailer strangely, asking if he was having mechanical trouble, hearing strange sounds coming from his rig. Daniel lied, claiming it was just the refrigeration unit acting up, and drove away before anyone could investigate further. Night fell again as he crossed into Louisiana, approaching New Orleans. The delivery address led to an industrial area near the port, a neighborhood of warehouses and shipping facilities surrounded by chain-link fences. Daniel's GPS directed him to a specific building, unmarked and anonymous, with a large loading dock and security cameras visible at every corner. Armed guards stood at the entrance wearing uniforms that bore no company logo, no identification. Daniel backed up to the loading dock as directed. The guards approached, efficient and silent, checking his identification and paperwork. One of them climbed into his trailer while Daniel waited in his cab, listening to the sounds from the cargo bay, the thumping and scratching and occasional screaming. Minutes passed. Then the guard climbed down, nodded to his colleague, and they began the unloading process. A supervisor approached Daniel's window, an older man with gray hair and cold eyes. He handed Daniel an envelope. "Your payment, Mr. Reeves, plus a bonus for your discretion." Daniel took the envelope, feeling thick stacks of cash inside. The supervisor continued, "You've done good work tonight. We appreciate your professionalism. However, I need to make something clear. You saw nothing. You transported nothing unusual. This delivery never happened. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded, unable to speak. The supervisor's cold eyes bored into him. "If you speak to anyone about this, we'll know. If you involve any authorities, we'll know. And the consequences will be severe, not just for you, but for your family. Your wife Lisa, your daughter Jennifer, who's studying at the University of Minnesota. We know where they are, Mr. Reeves. We always know. So you'll go home. You'll continue your normal life, and you'll forget this delivery ever occurred." The threat was explicit, personal, terrifying. Daniel's hands clenched on the steering wheel. These people knew everything about him, had researched his family, were willing to threaten them to ensure his silence. He nodded again, not trusting himself to speak. The supervisor smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Excellent. You're free to go. Safe travels, Mr. Reeves." Daniel pulled away from the facility, his empty trailer feeling lighter but his conscience heavier than any cargo he'd ever carried. He drove north through the night, putting distance between himself and New Orleans, trying to process what had happened. He'd transported something horrifying, something that suggested scientific experiments or biological manipulation far beyond anything publicly acknowledged. He'd been paid well for it, but the money felt contaminated, wrong. He considered going to the authorities anyway, despite the threats. But every time he reached for his phone, he thought of Lisa and Jennifer. Thought of those cold eyes and explicit threats and couldn't do it. He was trapped by fear, complicit in whatever horror those containers held, whatever purpose they served. Daniel Reeves completed that trip and went home, saying nothing to anyone. He deposited the money in his account, the bonus large enough to pay off his mortgage and his daughter's student loans. Blood money, purchased with his silence and moral compromise. He continued driving trucks, taking normal cargo on normal routes, trying to convince himself that what happened in July of 2024 was an isolated incident, something he could move past. But he can't forget. He dreams about those things in the amber fluid, those transformed bodies with their too large eyes and fish teeth, kept alive for purposes he doesn't want to imagine. He wonders how many other shipments like his have occurred, how many other drivers have been paid to transport horrors across the country, how many facilities exist where things that were once human are stored and studied and used. The thumping follows him. Sometimes, driving at night with an empty trailer, he swears he can still hear it, that rhythmic pulse like a massive heart beating. He knows it's imagination, knows his trailer is empty and clean. But the sound persists, a reminder that he carried something profoundly wrong, that he chose money and safety over intervention, that somewhere in New Orleans those 10 containers were opened and their contents deployed or studied or released for purposes he'll never know. Daniel drives more carefully now, refuses long-distance jobs, sticks to routes he knows well with cargo he can verify. But he understands that the American trucking industry, like the highway system itself, has dark corners where terrible things are transported under mundane paperwork and official seals. He knows that drivers like him are sometimes unwitting accomplices to operations that exist in shadows. Operations that use the vast logistics network to move horrors from place to place under the cover of normalcy. And he knows that those cold eyes are still watching, that the people who hired him once could hire him again, that his silence has been purchased but not his freedom. He's marked now, compromised, someone who can be threatened and controlled because he made the choice to prioritize his family's safety over exposing the truth. It's a choice he understands but can't forgive himself for. A weight that grows heavier with each mile he drives, each night he lies awake, remembering the thumping and the screaming and the things that floated in amber fluid with their black eyes watching. Story 6. The Town That Moved. Catherine Walsh had 19 years behind the wheel when she drove into a town that shouldn't have existed where it did. She was hauling construction materials from Kansas City to Denver in September of 2023, taking Highway 56 through rural Kansas. It was a route she'd driven dozens of times, knew every curve and landmark, every rest stop and crossroad. Around dusk, she was approaching a stretch of highway that normally ran through empty farmland for 40 miles without any significant towns or even gas stations. But ahead, she saw buildings. Not just a gas station or a cluster of houses, but an entire town, complete with a downtown area, church steeple, water tower, streets lined with shops and homes. Catherine frowned, confused and disoriented. This hadn't been here last month when she'd driven this exact route. Towns didn't just appear overnight. They took years to build, decades to establish. She checked her GPS, which showed her position as correct but displayed no town at this location. According to the digital map, she was driving through empty agricultural land, nothing but fields and farms. She slowed down as she entered what the welcome sign identified as Millbrook, Kansas, population 1,247, established 1893. The town looked prosperous and well-maintained, with red brick buildings lining Main Street, cars parked along the curb, streetlights beginning to flicker on in the gathering darkness. People walked on the sidewalks, going about their evening business, entering shops, chatting with neighbors. Everything appeared completely normal except for the fundamental impossibility of the town's existence in this location. Catherine pulled into a gas station at the edge of town, her mind racing with confusion. The station was vintage in style, with analog pumps and a hand-painted sign advertising prices that were decades out of date. A teenager in a uniform shirt approached as she climbed down from her cab, his smile friendly and genuine. "Fill her up, ma'am?" he asked cheerfully. Catherine nodded, still disoriented and trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "Where am I exactly?" she asked, her voice uncertain. The teenager looked confused by the question, his smile faltering slightly. "Millbrook, ma'am. You're at Ed's service station on Highway 56. Need directions somewhere?" She paid in cash, watching as the teenager accepted modern bills without comment despite the station's vintage appearance and outdated price signs. While he fueled her truck, Catherine walked to the station's office, hoping to find answers or at least a reasonable explanation. An older man sat behind the counter reading a newspaper. Catherine glanced at the date on the paper. September 9th, 2023. Current. Today's date. "Excuse me," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I've driven this highway many times and I've never seen Millbrook before. Has this town always been here?" The man looked up from his newspaper, his expression friendly but genuinely puzzled by her question. Millbrook's been here since 1893, according to the Town History Museum down on Oak Street. You must have been taking a different route before, maybe Interstate 70 to the north? Catherine shook her head firmly. No. I always take Highway 56 through here. There should be 40 miles of farmland between Kinsley and Larned, not a town. No town has ever been here before. The man's smile faded slightly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Well, I can assure you Millbrook is very real. We've got over 1,000 people living here, businesses, schools, churches, a hospital. We're as real as anywhere else in Kansas. Catherine felt a chill despite the warm September evening air. Something was profoundly wrong, but she couldn't articulate exactly what. The town felt real, looked real, populated by people who seemed genuinely confused by her questions. She thanked the man, paid for her fuel, and decided to drive through Millbrook to the other side, to see if the highway continued normally beyond the town limits. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she'd taken a wrong turn without realizing it. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation she was missing. Main Street was busy with evening activity. People entered and exited shops carrying bags and packages. Families sat at outdoor tables at a small cafe, eating dinner and talking. Teenagers gathered near a drugstore, laughing and sharing phones. Catherine drove slowly, studying everything with growing unease. The architecture was consistent with a real Midwestern town, buildings ranging from historic brick structures to more modern construction from various decades. Not a town frozen in time, but one that had apparently grown and changed over more than a century. Street signs marked intersections with names like Oak Street, Maple Avenue, Lincoln Road, Washington Boulevard. All normal, all impossible. At the far end of Main Street, Catherine noticed something deeply odd. The buildings ended abruptly, transitioning directly from downtown shops to empty highway with no suburban sprawl. No outlying homes or businesses, no gradual fade into rural landscape. Towns didn't work that way, especially towns of over 1,000 people. There should be residential neighborhoods spreading out from the center, gas stations and fast food restaurants on the outskirts, gradually thinning development. But Millbrook just stopped, as if someone had drawn a precise border and nothing was permitted beyond it. One moment she was passing storefronts, the next moment she was on empty highway with darkness pressing in on both sides. Catherine continued driving west, expecting to leave the town behind and return to the familiar empty farmland she'd driven through countless times. She watched her odometer counting the miles, but after 10 minutes of driving she saw buildings ahead again through the darkness. The same buildings. Millbrook's welcome sign appeared in her headlights, the same gas station, the same Main Street. She'd somehow circled back to the beginning of town despite driving straight on the highway without making any turns. Panic fluttered in her chest, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. She pulled over to the shoulder and checked her GPS carefully, zooming in and out, switching to satellite view. According to the GPS, she'd driven 15 miles west from where she'd first encountered Millbrook. The route showed a straight line, no curves, no loops, no circles. But she was back at the beginning of town. The same welcome sign, the same buildings in the same positions. It was impossible. The laws of physics didn't work this way. Roads didn't loop back on themselves without curves or intersections. Catherine felt her rational mind struggling against what her eyes were showing her. She tried again, this time driving faster, keeping her eyes fixed on the road ahead, watching for any turns or intersections she might have missed. The highway remained straight, 2 lanes of asphalt cutting through darkness. She passed through Millbrook, saw the abrupt end of buildings continued into empty highway. She counted to herself, marking time and distance. 10 minutes, 15, 20. And then, impossibly, The welcome sign appeared again. Millbrook, Kansas. Population 1,247. Established 1893. Catherine pulled into the same gas station, her heart pounding. The teenager was still there, still wearing his uniform shirt, but now he looked at her with recognition. "Back again, ma'am. Forget something?" Catherine stared at him. "I just left here 30 minutes ago. I drove west. How am I back here?" The teenager's smile faded completely, replaced by an expression that was almost sympathetic. "You're trying to leave, aren't you? They always try to leave it first." "They? Who's they? What do you mean?" Catherine demanded, her voice rising. The teenager glanced toward the office, then back at Catherine, lowering his voice. "The travelers who find us. Millbrook isn't always in the same place. We move. Or maybe the roads move. I don't really understand it. I was born here, never been anywhere else. But travelers like you, they find us sometimes, and some of them can't leave." Catherine felt ice water flood her veins. "Can't leave? What do you mean can't leave?" The teenager's expression was genuinely apologetic. "The town holds on to some people, not everyone. Some drive through and never notice anything wrong. But others, like you, they see that we're not where we should be, and then the roads don't let them go. The loops keep bringing them back." Catherine backed away from him, her mind reeling. This was insane. Towns didn't move. Roads didn't create impossible loops. There had to be a rational explanation. She climbed back into her cab and grabbed her phone, trying to call for help. No signal. She tried her radio. Static on every channel. She checked her GPS again, and this time she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The satellite view showed farmland at her location. No town, no buildings, just empty fields. But through her windshield she could see Millbrook clearly, streetlights glowing, people walking, cars driving past. She decided to try something different. Instead of driving west on the highway, she'd turn onto one of Millbrook's side streets, navigate through the town's grid, and exit from a different direction. She pulled out of the gas station and turned onto Oak Street, driving slowly through a residential neighborhood. Houses lined both sides, neat yards with trimmed grass, porch lights glowing warmly. She followed Oak Street south, watching the house numbers increase, then turned west onto Maple Avenue. She continued through the grid, making turns at every opportunity, trying to navigate out of town through sheer persistence. But every road eventually curved back to Main Street. Every side street seemed to loop impossibly, defying the grid pattern she could see. She'd turn right 3 times, which should have brought her back to her starting point, but instead, she'd end up on a completely different street. The town's geography was wrong, the streets connecting in ways that violated basic geometry. After an hour of trying, she found herself back on Main Street near the center of town, no closer to escape. Catherine pulled over and sat in her cab, trying to control her breathing, trying to think rationally. The sun had set completely now, and Millbrook glowed under streetlights and shop windows. She saw a diner across the street, its neon sign advertising homemade pie. She needed to talk to someone, needed to find answers. She climbed down and walked into the diner, a bell chiming as she opened the door. The interior was classic Americana, red vinyl booths and a long counter, black and white checkered floor. About a dozen people sat scattered throughout the space, eating dinner or drinking coffee. They all looked up when Catherine entered, and she saw the same expression on every face, recognition mixed with sympathy. A waitress approached, middle-aged, with tired eyes. "First night?" she asked quietly. "First night of what?" Catherine asked, though she was beginning to understand. The waitress gestured to a booth. "Sit down, honey. I'll get you coffee. We should talk." Catherine slid into the booth, and the waitress returned moments later with 2 cups of coffee sitting across from her. "My name's Carol. I've been in Millbrook for 16 years now." I was driving through Kansas, hauling textiles when I found this place. Couldn't leave. Some of us are like that. We're stuck here. Catherine's hands shook as she lifted the coffee cup. 16 years? You've been trapped here for 16 years? Carol nodded. Not everyone gets stuck. Most travelers drive through without noticing anything strange. But some of us, we see that Millbrook isn't where it should be, and once we see it, the town doesn't let us go. I don't know why. I don't know how it works, but I've accepted it. This is my life now. There has to be a way out, Catherine insisted. I have a daughter in Denver. I have a life. I can't just disappear into some impossible town that shouldn't exist. Carol's expression was compassionate but firm. I had a life too. Husband, 2 kids, grandchildren I've never met. But I've tried everything. Every road out of Millbrook loops back. Every attempt to walk out ends with me somehow circling back to town. Even phones don't work, radios don't work, nothing connects to the outside world. We're isolated here, cut off from everything. Catherine spent that night in the diner talking to Carol and others who'd become trapped in Millbrook over the years. A trucker named James who'd been there for 8 years. A traveling salesman named Robert who'd been there for 23 years. A young woman named Lisa who'd been there for just 6 months, still angry and desperate, still trying to find escape routes that didn't exist. They all had the same story. They'd driven through Kansas, found Millbrook where it shouldn't be, and became trapped in endless loops that always returned them to the town. As dawn approached, Catherine tried one more time. She drove west on Highway 56, pushing her truck to the maximum safe speed, determined to break free through sheer velocity. But the loop continued. No matter how fast she drove, no matter how far the odometer claimed she'd traveled, Millbrook always reappeared ahead, the welcome sign mocking her with its cheerful announcement of population and establishment date. She spent 3 days trapped in the loops, trying every strategy she could imagine. She drove at different times of day, tried different roads, even attempted to drive across empty fields to bypass the town entirely. Nothing worked. The landscape itself seemed to shift and reorganize, always bringing her back to Millbrook. She tried to stay awake, suspecting that she was somehow losing time or consciousness during the drives, but even fully alert and caffeinated, the impossible loops continued. On the 4th morning, Catherine woke in her cab, parked at that same gas station, and found that something had changed. The teenager approached with her usual fuel offer, but this time when she tried to drive west, the highway didn't loop. She continued through empty farmland, mile after mile, watching the odometer climb, watching Millbrook disappear in her mirrors and stay disappeared. After an hour, she reached Larned, a real town marked on her GPS, populated by people who'd never heard of Millbrook. Catherine completed her delivery to Denver 3 days late, telling her client she'd had mechanical trouble. She told no one about Millbrook, knowing how insane it would sound, but she researched obsessively for months, finding fragments of similar stories scattered across the internet. Other drivers reporting towns that appeared where they shouldn't be, impossible loops on straight highways, places that trap travelers for days or years before mysteriously releasing them. She found references to a Millbrook, Kansas that had existed in the 19th century but was abandoned in 1927 when the railroad route changed. The town had been dismantled, buildings moved or destroyed, population relocated. It had ceased to exist nearly a century ago. But Catherine had been there, had walked its streets, had talked to people who'd been trapped there for decades. Catherine Walsh still drives trucks, but she refuses routes through rural Kansas. She's heard from other drivers about Millbrook sightings, the town appearing on different highways, always at dusk, always populated by the same trapped travelers and locals who were born into the impossibility. Some drivers report seeing the town and driving through without incident. Others report becoming trapped for hours or days before being mysteriously released. And some, according to whispered rumors at truck stops, never come back at all. Their trucks found abandoned on Kansas highways, drivers vanished without trace. Catherine knows now that American geography has layers, places that exist outside normal space, towns that drift through the landscape like ghosts. She knows that Millbrook is out there somewhere, moving through Kansas or maybe through other states, appearing to travelers at dusk, trapping some and releasing others according to rules no one understands. She knows that Carol and James and Robert and Lisa are still there, still trapped, still hoping for the day the town decides to let them go. And sometimes, driving through unfamiliar territory at dusk, Catherine sees welcome signs for towns that aren't on her GPS, streetlights glowing in places that should be empty. She always drives past without slowing, never stopping, never investigating. She's learned that some mysteries demand to remain unsolved, that some places should never be acknowledged, that the price of curiosity can be years of your life spent in an impossible town that moves through the landscape like a predator, collecting travelers and holding them in loops that defy every law of physics and geography. Story 7. Ghosts on Channel 19. Bill "Dusty" Redding had driven 1,000,000 miles in nearly 28 years, his voice a regular presence on CB Channel 19 across the Midwest. He was known from Omaha to Indianapolis, from Milwaukee to Memphis, a steady voice offering road advice, weather updates, and the occasional joke to break up the monotony of long-haul driving. Other truckers knew his call sign the way they knew the interstate numbers, recognized his gravelly tone before he even identified himself. Bill was private about personal matters, his wife's death from cancer 3 years earlier, his son's estrangement after a bitter argument about the family business. But on the CB, he was everyone's friend, always ready with encouragement or information. Only a handful of people knew why Bill stopped using his radio after May of 2023. Why his voice disappeared from Channel 19. Why other drivers would call for Dusty and receive only silence. The few who knew didn't talk about it, didn't share the story because speaking it aloud made it too real, too impossible to dismiss as hallucination or equipment malfunction. That spring, Bill was running eastbound from Omaha, Nebraska, with a flatbed loaded with steel coils heading for Gary, Indiana. The load was heavy, the weather uncertain, tornado watches posted across Iowa and Illinois. Bill had driven through worse storms, had navigated ice and fog and winds that threatened to flip his trailer, but he respected severe weather and paid attention to forecasts. The sky that evening was bruised purple along the horizon, clouds building into towering formations that promised violence. He departed Omaha just after 6 in the evening, planning to drive through the night and reach Gary by dawn. Traffic was light, other drivers apparently heeding the weather warnings and finding places to wait out the storms. Bill kept his radio on Channel 19, listening to scattered chatter about road conditions and radar reports. The usual voices, the regular drivers who worked these routes, sharing information in the informal network that kept everyone safer and better informed than any official traffic report could manage. Just after midnight, somewhere between Des Moines and Iowa City, Bill's radio crackled with an unfamiliar voice. Female, weary, with a slight West Texas lilt that stood out among the Midwestern accents Bill was accustomed to hearing. Breaker 19, anyone copy? Looking for eastbound traffic near Vandalia. The transmission was scratchy, distorted by static, but clear enough to understand. Bill waited for someone else to respond, but the channel remained silent except for the carrier wave hiss. He pressed his microphone button. Copy Vandalia. This is Dusty headed eastbound on 80. What's your 20? Standard CB protocol, asking for the other driver's location so he could provide relevant information. The reply came after a moment of static, the woman's voice tight with something Bill couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or exhaustion pushed to its limits. "Keep your lights low. Don't stop at the next service plaza. He's on the ramp." Bill frowned, confused by the cryptic warning. "Say again? Who's on the ramp?" More static, then the sound of labored breathing, almost like sobbing. "Just don't stop. Keep driving. Don't let him see you slowing down." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only the background hiss of the empty channel. Bill shook his head, assuming it was some kind of CB prank. Bored drivers sometimes got creative with their entertainment, making up stories or playing elaborate jokes on each other. He'd participated in his share over the years, understood the appeal of breaking up the monotony with a little manufactured drama. But something about the woman's voice bothered him, a genuine distress that seemed too authentic to be performance. 20 minutes later, he approached a service plaza, one of the standard interstate rest areas with fuel pumps, restaurants, and parking for trucks and cars. Bill had stopped here dozens of times, knew the layout, the quality of the coffee, which pump dispensed fuel fastest. But as his headlights swept across the entrance ramp, he saw something that made his hands tighten on the steering wheel. A truck sat idling on the ramp, a battered Peterbilt that looked decades old, paint faded and rust visible even in the darkness. The cab lights were off, but the windshield shone as if illuminated from within by some internal light source. And in that glow, Bill glimpsed a figure behind the wheel, hunched over the steering wheel, face streaked with something dark that looked like blood in the strange illumination. The figure's head turned as Bill passed, tracking his movement, and for just a moment their eyes met. Ice flooded Bill's veins, his foot instinctively pressing harder on the accelerator. He'd seen something in those eyes, something wrong, an emptiness that suggested the figure behind that wheel wasn't entirely human or wasn't alive, or was something Bill's mind couldn't properly categorize. He sped past the service plaza without stopping, his heart hammering, telling himself he'd imagined it, that the strange lighting and the woman's warning had primed him to see threats where none existed. But minutes later, his CB crackled to life again, the woman's voice returning with greater urgency. "Dusty, eastbound, do not reply, just listen. He can hear us if you speak." Bill's hand froze halfway to the microphone. How did she know his call sign? He hadn't identified himself after that first transmission. And what did she mean about being heard? CB radio was open communication. Anyone monitoring Channel 19 could hear every transmission. That was the nature of the technology. He decided to listen without responding, his curiosity and unease balanced in uncomfortable tension. The woman continued, her voice emerging from waves of static. "He drives the old routes, the ones that don't exist anymore on maps. He's been driving since before you were born, since before I was born. He's looking for passengers. Don't stop. Don't answer if he calls. Don't look in your mirrors too long." Bill glanced at his mirrors reflexively, seeing only empty highway behind him, his trailer lights reflecting off wet pavement. The storm was building, first drops of rain spattering his windshield. He wanted to respond, wanted to ask who this woman was and what she was talking about, but her warning kept him silent. "He can hear us if you speak." The implication being that listening was safe, but talking was dangerous, though Bill couldn't understand why that would be true. The radio began cycling through voices then, a phenomenon Bill had never experienced in nearly 3 decades of using CB equipment. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, pouring from his speaker in a constant overlapping chorus. Men, women, different accents and regional dialects, even what sounded like children, all talking at once in a wall of sound that was impossible to parse into individual messages. But certain phrases repeated, emerged from the chaos with enough frequency that Bill could distinguish them. "Don't stop. Don't answer. Don't let him in. Don't turn around. Keep driving. Don't look back." His hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't equipment malfunction, wasn't interference from other channels. The voices were too clear, too purposeful, too organized despite their numbers. Bill reached for the radio controls, intending to switch to a different channel. But before he could touch the dial, all the voices stopped simultaneously, leaving ringing silence broken only by his labored breathing and the drum of rain on his roof. Through that silence came a new voice. Male. Deep, with an accent. Bill couldn't place words slightly archaic in their phrasing. Dusty. That's what they call you? Dusty Redding from Bellevue, Nebraska. You've been driving these roads for 28 years. You know them well. But do you know all the roads, Dusty? Do you know the ones that run alongside the ones you can see? The parallel routes where drivers who never stop driving still drive? Terror seized Bill's chest. This voice knew his full name, knew his hometown, knew details about him that shouldn't be available to random strangers on CB radio. He grabbed his microphone, ready to demand answers, but remembered the woman's warning. Do not reply. He can hear us if you speak. Bill forced himself to remain silent, to listen despite every instinct screaming at him to respond, to challenge this impossible voice. I've been watching you, Dusty. Watching lots of drivers, looking for the right ones. The lonely ones. The ones who talk to ghosts on the radio because they have no one else. Your wife is gone. Your son doesn't speak to you. You drive and talk to strangers because that's all you have left. I can give you company, Dusty. I can ride with you. You'll never be alone again. Bill's breath came in ragged gasps. Rain pounded harder now, his wipers struggling to keep up, visibility reduced to a few dozen feet of illuminated highway. He pushed his speed higher despite the dangerous conditions. Desperate to put distance between himself and that idling Peterbilt, between himself and the voice that knew too much, that promised things Bill didn't want to contemplate. Figures appeared along the shoulder of the highway, visible for brief moments in his headlights before vanishing. People standing in the rain, drenched and motionless, faces pale and eyes hollow. Some raised their hands as Bill passed, whether in greeting or supplication he couldn't tell. One figure, an old man in trucker's clothing from decades past, stepped directly into Bill's path. Bill jerked the wheel instinctively, swerving, feeling his trailer begin to fishtail on the wet pavement. He fought for control, somehow managing to straighten out, and when he looked back, the figure was gone, nothing but empty highway visible in his mirrors. The woman's voice cut through Channel 19 again, clearer now, cutting through static with desperate urgency. Keep driving, Bill. Don't stop for anything. Don't answer him. He's drawn to the ones who respond, the ones who engage. As long as you stay silent, as long as you keep moving, he can't touch you. But if you stop, if you speak to him, he'll find a way into your cab and you'll become like us. Voices on the radio, warnings that no one heeds, ghosts trying to save the next driver from making our mistakes. Bill wanted to ask how she knew these things, wanted to understand what was happening, but he kept silent. His jaw ached from clenching, his shoulders burned with tension, but he drove on through the storm. More figures appeared and disappeared along the roadside, dozens of them now, maybe hundreds, a procession of the lost standing vigil along the highway. Some were clearly truckers wearing clothing from different eras, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, decades of drivers stretching back to the early days of commercial trucking. Others wore the clothes of different times, suggesting this phenomenon was older than the interstate system, older than motor vehicles, perhaps as old as roads themselves. At every overpass, Bill caught glimpses of vehicles from other eras, old trucks from the 40s and 50s, rigs that should have been in museums or scrapyards, parked at impossible angles or driving in the opposite direction despite this being a one-way highway. He saw a convoy of World War II-era trucks, military olive drab faded with age, driving in perfect formation without headlights. He saw a Studebaker pickup from the 30s, a driver visible behind the wheel who turned to stare at Bill with empty eye sockets. The male voice returned, no longer friendly or inviting, now angry and demanding. "You're being rude, Dusty. I'm offering you companionship and you ignore me? I've been alone on these roads for longer than you can imagine. Decades, centuries maybe. Time moves differently on the parallel routes. I just want someone to talk to, someone to share the endless miles. Answer me, Dusty, just say one word. Just acknowledge me." Bill's hand hovered over the microphone, some deep social conditioning making him want to respond, to be polite, to acknowledge the voice addressing him. But the chorus of voices erupted again, shouting warnings. "Don't answer, stay silent, keep driving." The woman's voice rose above the others. "He's lying, Bill. He doesn't want companionship, he wants to feed. He wants to pull you into the parallel routes where you'll drive forever, never aging, never stopping, never reaching any destination, just driving through darkness and rain until you become another voice warning the next victim." Bill clamped his jaw shut, physically biting his tongue to prevent any sound from escaping. He focused on driving, on maintaining control of his truck through the storm, on putting miles between himself and that service plaza where the thing in the Peterbilt waited. His GPS showed him progressing normally along Interstate 80, approaching the Illinois border, but Bill no longer trusted his instruments. The world outside his windows had become something else, somewhere else. A highway that existed adjacent to the one he'd been driving, populated by the lost and the dead and the things that hunted them. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, time becoming as unreliable as geography. The rain continued, the voices cycled through warnings and threats, and Bill drove in silence, his jaw aching, his bladder screaming, his hands cramped on the wheel. He passed through what should have been Iowa City, but the lights were wrong, buildings visible through the rain that didn't match his memories of the area. He passed through what should have been the Quad Cities, but the bridges looked different, older, and the traffic consisted entirely of vehicles from wrong time periods. Then, gradually, the rain began to ease. The voices on the radio faded, the chorus of warnings diminishing to whispers and then to nothing. The figures along the roadside became less frequent, less substantial, like images projected on fog. Bill's GPS stabilized, showing him clearly on Interstate 80 just west of the Illinois-Indiana border. The highway looked normal again, modern vehicles appearing in the sparse late-night traffic, rest areas and truck stops displaying familiar corporate logos. At dawn, the storm cleared completely. Bill pulled into a crowded truck stop near Gary, his destination city, his body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline crash. He sat in his parking space for 30 minutes before he could trust his legs to support him. Other drivers moved around the lot, normal people going about normal business, and Bill had never been so grateful for mundane reality. He checked his CB radio, finding Channel 19 filled with standard morning chatter about traffic and weather and the locations of speed traps. No mysterious voices, no warnings, no threats, just regular drivers communicating regular information. Bill scrolled through his radio's channels, listening to each one briefly. All normal, all empty of the impossible chorus he'd heard during the night. But when he returned to Channel 19, he heard something that made his blood freeze. The woman's voice, very faint, emerging from background static. "Thank you for listening, Bill. Thank you for not answering. You're safe now. But remember us. Remember the ones who drive the parallel routes. And if you hear him calling to you again, stay silent. Always stay silent." Bill grabbed his microphone, ready to respond, ready to ask the questions that had burned in his mind all night. But he stopped himself, remembering her warnings, remembering what she'd said about answering. He set the microphone down and switched off his radio instead, silence filling his cab. For the next 3 months, Bill drove without his CB radio. He made deliveries, covered his routes, maintained his schedule, but he did it in silence, using his phone for necessary communications. avoiding the community of drivers he'd been part of for nearly 3 decades. Other drivers noticed, asked about it when they encountered him at truck stops or loading docks. "Where you been, Dusty? Haven't heard you on the radio in forever." Bill would shrug, make excuses about equipment problems or just preferring quiet these days. But late at night, in truck stop parking lots, unable to sleep, Bill would sometimes turn on his radio. He'd tune it to Channel 19 and listen without speaking, monitoring the conversations of other drivers. And occasionally, very occasionally, he'd hear the woman's voice, distant and distorted, warning someone else. "Don't stop, don't answer, keep driving." He'd hear the chorus of voices, that wall of warnings from hundreds or thousands of lost drivers. And sometimes he'd hear the male voice, patient and predatory, offering companionship to lonely drivers on dark highways. Bill tried to warn people, tried to explain what lurked on the parallel routes that existed alongside the interstates, but no one believed him. They thought he'd had a breakdown, suggested he was dealing with grief and isolation, recommended therapy or medication or retirement. So he stopped trying to explain and just listened, bearing witness to the ongoing hunt that played out on CB frequencies every night. 6 months after his experience, Bill heard a transmission that made him break his silence. A young female driver new to the profession, excited about her first cross-country run, chatting enthusiastically on Channel 19 about the freedom of the road and the beauty of the empty highways. And then Bill heard the male voice, smooth and friendly, engaging her in conversation, learning her name and route, offering advice and encouragement. Bill grabbed his microphone. "Don't answer him," he shouted. "Get off the radio right now, don't respond to that voice." Static filled the channel. Then the woman who'd warned him months earlier spoke. "Bill, no. You've broken silence. He can hear you now. He can find you." Terror flooded through Bill, realization of what he'd done crashing over him. He'd spoken on the radio, had engaged with the presence that hunted Channel 19, had marked himself as prey in his attempt to save someone else. The male voice purred with satisfaction. "Dusty, it's been so long. I thought you'd forgotten about me. But here you are, speaking again, making yourself heard. Thank you. I've been so very patient." Bill switched off the radio and sat in his darkened cab, listening to his hammering heart. He'd made a mistake, had violated the one rule that had kept him safe, and now he'd have to live with the consequences. Or perhaps not live. Perhaps he'd become another voice in the chorus, another warning that no one would heed, another ghost driving the parallel routes forever. That night, Bill sold his truck. He retired from trucking completely, took a job at a warehouse in Bellevue, working day shifts, sleeping in his own bed every night, avoiding highways and long drives. He threw away his CB radio, refused to even listen to recordings or transmissions. He tried to convince himself he was safe, that by leaving the profession he'd escaped the thing that hunted Channel 19. But sometimes, late at night, his phone would ring with no caller ID. When he answered, he'd hear only static, and beneath it, that familiar male voice. "Soon, Dusty. Soon you'll drive with me." His car radio would switch to CB frequencies on its own, filling his vehicle with warnings and threats. And when he drove, even short trips around town, he'd sometimes glimpse a battered Peterbilt in his mirrors, following at a distance, headlights off, windshield glowing with internal light. Bill Redding still lives in Bellevue, still works at the warehouse, still avoids highways whenever possible. He knows the thing from Channel 19 is patient, knows it has eternity to wait, knows that eventually he'll make another mistake or grow complacent or simply run out of time. He knows that the parallel routes are always there, always accessible, always populated by the lost drivers who answered when they should have stayed silent. And sometimes, driving home from work in the evening twilight, Bill sees figures standing on street corners or walking along sidewalks, translucent and wrong, wearing the clothes of different eras, staring at him with hollow eyes. He knows they're from the parallel routes, knows they're somehow bleeding through into his world, knows that the boundary between the normal highways and the haunted ones is growing thinner. He knows that one day he'll be driving and suddenly realize he's crossed over without noticing, that he's become one of the voices on Channel 19, warning drivers who won't listen, trying to save people from the thing that hunts the frequencies. The thing that's been driving since before interstates existed, since before motor vehicles existed. Perhaps since the first roads were carved through wilderness by travelers who didn't return. Bill doesn't use CB radio anymore. He doesn't drive trucks anymore. He doesn't travel anymore. But the voice still finds him, still calls to him, still promises companionship on endless roads through eternal darkness. And Bill knows, with terrible certainty, that eventually he'll answer. Everyone does eventually. The thing on Channel 19 is very, very patient, and it has nothing but time. Story 8, The Frozen Man of Highway 33. Rafael Torres knew ice and snow like his own heartbeat, growing up in the brutal winters of northern Minnesota, where temperatures could drop to 40 below zero and stay there for weeks. He'd learned to drive in blizzards, had navigated whiteout conditions that would terrify most experienced truckers, understood how black ice formed and where it hid on highway surfaces. After joining his uncle's trucking company at 19, Rafael had spent 12 years running routes between Duluth and Fargo, between International Falls and Grand Forks, hauling everything from lumber to mining equipment across the frozen north. By December of 2024, at 31 years old, Rafael considered himself an expert in winter driving, confident in his ability to handle whatever the season threw at him. That confidence would be tested in ways he never imagined on a night when the temperature dropped to 28 below zero, and something that shouldn't exist appeared on Highway 33 near Red Lake, Minnesota. Rafael had accepted a rush delivery job picking up industrial equipment from International Falls and running it south to Bemidji. The forecast predicted a deep freeze but clear skies, no precipitation, just brutal cold. Perfect conditions for making time, Rafael thought, loading his trailer in the late afternoon as the sun set and temperatures plummeted. He departed International Falls just after 6 in the evening, his truck's engine warm, heater blasting, thermoses full of hot coffee on the seat beside him. The highway was empty, most sensible people staying indoors when the thermometer dropped this low. Even the wildlife stayed hidden, deer and moose seeking shelter from the killing cold. Rafael's headlights cut through crystalline air, frost glittering on trees like diamond dust, the night so clear he could see every star in the cloudless sky. Highway 33 ran through dense forest and around frozen lakes, a 2-lane road that wound south through some of the most isolated terrain in Minnesota. Civilization was sparse here, just occasional tiny towns and scattered homes with long stretches of nothing but trees and darkness between settlements. Rafael had driven this route hundreds of times, knew every curve and hill, every spot where deer might cross or where ice tended to form. The road held no mysteries for him, or so he believed. Around 9:30, perhaps 40 miles south of International Falls, Rafael's headlights caught something on the highway ahead. A figure standing in the center of the southbound lane, perfectly still. Rafael's foot moved to the brake automatically, his mind processing what he was seeing with confusion and alarm. Who would be standing on a highway in the middle of nowhere at 28 below zero? He brought the truck to a careful stop about 30 feet from the figure, hazard lights blinking in the darkness. Through the windshield, Rafael could see details that made his chest tighten with fear and concern. The man, it was definitely a man tall and broad-shouldered, wore an old army surplus parka that looked decades old, the green fabric faded and frost-covered. His head was bare, no hat despite the brutal temperature, dark hair thick with ice crystals. His hands hung at his sides, exposed to the cold, skin visible and appearing blue-tinged even in the harsh glare of the headlights. He didn't move as Raphael's truck approached, didn't react to the lights or the sound of the engine, just stood facing south as if waiting for something. Raphael grabbed his own heavy coat and gloves, shoving his door open against the resistance of cold, thickened air. The temperature hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, freezing the moisture in his nostrils instantly. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. "You all right out here?" The figure didn't respond, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge Raphael's presence in any way. Raphael approached carefully, boots crunching on the frozen pavement, his breath creating clouds of vapor that froze and fell as tiny ice crystals. As he got closer, he could see that the man was in terrible condition. His face was pale, lips blue, skin waxy and frozen-looking. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead, but the pupils appeared glazed with frost. White crystals visible on the surface of his eyes. This man should be dead, Raphael thought. No one could survive standing in this temperature dressed like this, not for more than minutes. But as Raphael reached out to touch the man's shoulder, those frozen eyes blinked. Once, slowly, ice cracking at the corners. The man's lips moved, making sounds that were barely audible over the wind. Cold. So cold. Need to find the way back. Raphael's training took over, his first aid knowledge pushing aside his shock and fear. This man was severely hypothermic, probably in the final stages before death, experiencing the paradoxical undressing and confused behavior that characterized extreme cold exposure. He needed warming immediately, needed shelter and medical attention. "Come on," Raphael said, gripping the man's arm. The flesh beneath the parka felt wrong, too hard, frozen solid like meat pulled from a deep freezer. "My truck's right here, we'll get you warm." The man moved stiffly, joints seeming frozen, each step mechanical and labored. Raphael guided him to the passenger side of the cab, helping him climb up, the man's movements slow and uncertain like someone relearning how to use their body. Raphael climbed into the driver's seat and cranked the heater to maximum warm air blasting into the cab. He grabbed blankets from his sleeper berth, wrapping them around the frozen man, then poured hot coffee from one of his thermoses into a cup. "Drink this," Raphael instructed, holding the cup to the man's blue lips. "Slowly. Just sips." The man's hands came up, taking the cup, and Raphael noticed with horror that the man's fingers were black at the tips, severe frostbite having destroyed the tissue. How long had he been out there? Hours? Days? The man sipped the coffee, his throat working to swallow, steam rising from the cup and fogging his frozen face. Raphael pulled out his phone to call for medical help, but there was no signal. Not unusual in this remote area, but frustrating given the emergency. He'd have to drive to the next town, to Mizpah or Kelleher, somewhere with cell coverage and emergency services. "What's your name?" Raphael asked, putting the truck in gear and starting to roll slowly forward. "How long have you been out there?" The man turned his head, the movement accompanied by audible cracking sounds like ice breaking. When he spoke, his voice was clearer but strange, the cadence wrong, the accent old-fashioned. "My name? I had a name, Thomas Ennis. Is it 1978? Where's Darlene? Where's my truck? I was driving, there was ice on the road, the truck went into the ditch. I got out to check the trailer." When did the cold get so bad? Raphael's hands tightened on the steering wheel, unease crawling up his spine. 1978. That was 46 years ago. This man didn't look 60 or 70 years old. He looked perhaps 40, maybe younger under the frost and damage. "It's 2024, Raphael said carefully. "December. You're on Highway 33 in Minnesota. What do you remember?" The man, Thomas, stared out the windshield, his frosted eyes not quite focusing. 2024? That's not right. That's not possible. I was driving in February of '78. Had a load of mining equipment going to Bemidji. There was a storm, ice on the road. I went off the highway near Red Lake. I got out to assess the damage to see if I could get back on the road. The cold was bad, wind chill maybe 60 below. I tried to get back in the cab, but the door was frozen shut. I tried to break the window, but my hands weren't working right. I remember being so cold. I remember sitting down in the snow because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. And then, nothing. Just cold. Just endless cold. The temperature in the cab was dropping despite the heater running full blast. Raphael could see his breath now, white clouds forming with each exhalation. The thermometer on his dashboard showed the interior temperature falling, dropping from comfortable warmth to near freezing in the span of minutes. Frost began forming on the inside of the windows, intricate patterns spreading across the glass like living things. Thomas Ennis clutched Raphael's hand suddenly, his frozen fingers clamping down with surprising strength. His grip was agony, the cold from his flesh burning Raphael's skin even through the glove. "Is Darlene waiting for me? I never made it back to her. We were supposed to get married that spring. I promised her I'd be home for her birthday. Did she wait? Is she still waiting?" Raphael tried to pull his hand free, but Thomas's grip was iron strong, desperate. "I don't know who Darlene is," Raphael said, fighting panic. "Let go of my hand. You're hurting me." The cab was freezing now, the heater making no difference, their breath turning to ice crystals that hung in the air. The windows were completely frosted over, Raphael unable to see the road ahead, driving blind through the darkness. "I didn't mean to die," Thomas whispered, tears freezing on his cheeks as they fell, leaving trails of ice. "I didn't mean to leave her. I tried to stay warm, I tried to survive, but the cold, it got inside me, it became part of me, and now I can't get warm. I've been so cold for so long, decades of cold. Help me get home, please. Help me find Darlene. Maybe if I can get home, I can finally rest." The truck lurched suddenly, tires losing traction on ice that shouldn't be there, the road surface freezing solid beneath them. Raphael fought the wheel, trying to maintain control, but the cab was too cold now, his hands too numb. The truck slid sideways, trailer jackknifing, and Raphael felt the sickening moment of lost control as they left the pavement. The world rotated, headlights sweeping across trees and snow and darkness, and then impact, the grinding crunch of metal and the explosive hiss of airbags deploying. Raphael came to consciousness slowly, his head throbbing, warm liquid running down his face that he dimly recognized as blood. The truck had come to rest on its side in a snowbank, the cab tilted at a steep angle. The airbag had deflated, hanging limply from the steering wheel. And Thomas Ennis was gone, the passenger seat empty, only puddles of melted ice showing where he'd been. Raphael fumbled for his seatbelt, releasing it and falling against the passenger side door. His phone had fallen somewhere in the crash, lost in the chaos of scattered belongings. He kicked at the driver's side door now above him, managing to force it open after several attempts. Cold air rushed in, though it felt almost warm compared to the freezing atmosphere Thomas had brought into the cab. He climbed out onto the side of the truck, surveying the damage. They'd gone off the road, down an embankment, coming to rest against a stand of pine trees. The trailer had separated from the cab. Jackknifed at a severe angle, cargo scattered across the snow. In the dim illumination of the truck's remaining lights, Raphael could see a shape in the snow nearby. A truck, old and rusted, half buried in a drift. A Kenworth conventional from the '70s, faded paint barely visible under decades of weathering. The door hung open, interior dark and empty. Raphael slid down the side of his cab and approached the old truck on shaking legs. The registration was still visible on the door, faded but readable. Thomas Ennis, Duluth, Minnesota. The cab interior was pristine, preserved by the cold as if the driver had just stepped out moments ago. A photograph sat on the dashboard, protected under glass. A young woman with 70s-style hair and a bright smile. An inscription on the back that Raphael could read through the glass. To Tommy, love forever, Darlene. Understanding crashed over Raphael like a physical wave. Thomas Ennis had died here, in this spot or near it 46 years ago. Had frozen to death trying to get back to his truck after it went off the road. Had been found eventually, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe his body was still out here somewhere, buried under snow and ice, preserved by the brutal cold. And somehow, in the unique conditions of this night, in this place where he died, Thomas had appeared again, still trying to get home, still trying to complete the journey that had killed him. Raphael heard footsteps behind him crunching in the snow. He turned to see Thomas standing a few yards away, looking more transparent now, the starlight visible through his body. "This is where I died," Thomas said, his voice distant and echoing. "I remember now. I sat down in the snow right there by that tree. I couldn't feel my feet anymore, couldn't feel my hands. The cold had gone so deep. I thought about Darlene, about her waiting for me, about the wedding we'd never have. And then I just felt tired, so tired. I closed my eyes and the cold didn't hurt anymore." "I'm sorry," Raphael said, not knowing what else to say, how to respond to a ghost or a memory or whatever Thomas had become. "I'm so sorry you died alone out here." Thomas's form flickered like a candle flame in wind. "Darlene, did she?" He couldn't finish the question, but Raphael understood what he was asking. Raphael pulled out his phone. It had service now somehow, and searched quickly. Darlene Morrison, he found, had died in 2019, at 72 years old. Her obituary mentioned she'd never married, had waited for years for a trucker named Thomas Ennis who disappeared on a winter delivery run and was presumed dead. She'd eventually moved on with her life, but had kept his photograph until her death. "She waited," Raphael said softly. "She never forgot you. She's gone now too, passed away 5 years ago, but she remembered you her whole life." Thomas's transparent face crumpled, that same frozen expression somehow conveying deep grief. "She waited. All that time she waited, and I never made it home. I never even got to tell her goodbye." "Maybe you can tell her now," Raphael suggested, surprising himself with the words. "If she's gone too, maybe you can find her wherever people go after. Maybe you've just been stuck here, caught in this place where you died, but now you can move on. You can finally go home." Thomas looked at Raphael with those frosted eyes, and slowly, incrementally, his form began to fade. The cold that surrounded him dissipated, the temperature rising to normal winter levels rather than the killing freeze of his presence. "Thank you," Thomas whispered, his voice growing fainter. "Thank you for helping me remember. Thank you for telling me she waited. I can rest now. I can go find her." He vanished completely, not dramatically but gradually, like fog burning away in sunlight. The oppressive atmosphere of death and cold lifted, leaving Raphael alone in the winter darkness with 2 wrecked trucks, one ancient and one modern, both testimony to the dangers of ice and isolation. Raphael hiked back to the highway, his phone now working, and called for help. A tow truck and state patrol arrived within an hour, pulling his rig from the ditch, checking him for injuries. He told them he'd swerved to avoid hitting a deer, a plausible lie that explained the accident without requiring explanations about frozen ghosts. They found the old Kenworth, Thomas Ennis's truck, and noted it for recovery, saying it was probably a historical find, maybe worth salvaging for parts or museum display. But Raphael asked them to check for remains, and after some searching with proper equipment, They found Thomas Ennis's body still sitting against that pine tree, mummified by cold, preserved for 46 years. The recovery team treated the remains with respect, understanding they'd found a missing person from decades past. A mystery solved at last. Thomas Ennis could finally be properly buried, his family could have closure, and Darlene's nieces and nephews could know what had happened to the man their aunt had loved and mourned her entire life. Raphael completed his delivery 2 days later after his truck was repaired and continued working his northern routes through that winter and beyond. But he made a point every year to stop at the spot where Thomas Ennis had died. He'd leave a thermos of hot coffee and a photograph he'd printed of Darlene Morrison, a small memorial to a man who'd frozen to death trying to get home to the woman he loved. Other truckers began reporting similar encounters on Highway 33 and other isolated northern routes. Figures standing in the cold, frozen travelers from decades past appearing on the coldest nights and asking for help getting home. Some drivers picked them up and experienced the same terrifying cold, the same crashes or near misses. Others drove past, ignoring the figures, and wondered later if they'd left someone to die. Raphael always stopped now, always offered help, understanding that some spirits were trapped by the manner of their death, doomed to repeat their final moments until someone helped them remember, helped them find closure. The frozen roads of the north held many such ghosts, he learned. Truckers and travelers who'd succumbed to the brutal cold over decades of winter driving, who appeared on nights when conditions matched those of their deaths, seeking the completion of journeys that had ended in tragedy. The photograph of Darlene that had sat on Thomas Ennis's dashboard for 46 years now sits on Raphael's own dashboard, a reminder of love that transcends death, of promises kept even when keeping them is impossible, of the weight of waiting for someone who will never come home. Raphael looks at it sometimes when the cold presses in and the highway stretches empty before him, and remembers the frozen man who just wanted to get home, who carried the cold of his death with him like a burden he couldn't put down until someone finally helped him remember he could let go. Highway 33 still runs through the frozen north, still claims victims when the temperature drops and the ice forms and the wind howls through the darkness. But now, on the coldest nights, truckers report seeing a figure standing watch near that stand of pine trees. Not threatening, not asking for help, just standing vigil. Some say it's Thomas Ennis finally at peace, watching over other drivers to keep them safe from the fate that claimed him. Others say it's just shadow and starlight, imagination creating patterns in the darkness. But Raphael knows what he saw, knows what he experienced, knows that the cold that night was more than weather, that Thomas Ennis found his way home at last. And sometimes on the radio late at night, Raphael hears a voice thanking him, a whisper, carried on static. 2 words repeated softly. She waited. And Raphael smiles, knowing that somewhere beyond the frozen highways and the brutal cold, 2 people who loved each other have finally been reunited, their long separation ended, their journey completed at last.